MindVine, a mental health podcast for everyone. Since our first episode in 2016, we have been sharing stories of recovery, engaging with experts, and tackling the stigma associated with mental illness. The MindVine podcast is produced by Ontario Shores Centre for Mental Health Sciences and is available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to the MindVine podcast. I'm your host, Darryl Mathers, and today we have a special edition of the MindVine podcast where we're acknowledging, recognizing, and talking about the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We also have some Orange Shirt Week activities on Ontario Shore, specifically we're going to talk about, but moreover, we're going to have a conversation about what's going on in our community, what we need to do to support Indigenous communities, Indigenous culture here at Ontario Shores, but also in our larger community in Durham region. And to have this conversation, I have two very special guests from Ontario Shores with various different perspectives and roles, and I think it's all going to blend well together in this conversation we're about to have. So I'm going to start with Michener-Rousell, who's a social worker at our Ontario Structured Psychotherapy program. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks for having me, Darryl.
And we have Shauna Moore, who's our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion lead here at Ontario Shores. And Shauna, welcome. And you're going to start the podcast off with our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Darryl. So I'd first like to acknowledge that Ontario Shores sits on the lands of the people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, which is covered under the Williams Treaties. We are situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. And for me today, as I read this land acknowledgement, I'm reminded of all the unlearning and relearning that I need to do about Indigenous histories that I have learned.
Thank you, Shauna. I'm going to start the conversation, maybe with just a bit of background. Michelle, you identify as an Indigenous woman. I know you have been involved in Indigenous activities around the hospital on a number of occasions over the years. And thank you very much for just lending your perspective. I think it's really courageous of somebody in the Ontario Shores community to put yourself out here like you are, and I really appreciate you bringing your experience and your expertise. And I want to start with you, and then I'll ask Shauna the same question. When I say this is the second, I'm going to make sure I get it right, but the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation that's being recognized federally. So when I say that, what does that event, what does that title, what do those words mean to you?
I think, Darryl, what those words mean to me, there's in some ways, it seems like a simple question, but I think it's a really complex question. For me, there's many layers. I see myself as walking two worlds. Yes, I identify as Indigenous. My people are the Haudenosaunee people, or in English, the Iroquois Nation. But I also am part white, so I see that I have this unique perspective. So for me, what this actually means is stepping forward and really seeing the truth for what it is, the dark history of our country. And I think that it's about time we started talking about the history of our country. It's taking the words of what it means to be truthful and have reconciliation. But beyond that, it's starting to take our words and putting them into action. For a woman who identifies as Indigenous, but is completely disconnected from my culture because of the legacies of residential schools, because of the 60s scoop, it's very poignant for me because I'm not connected to my culture. I am in the sense that I read about my people, I read about my history, but I don't have a disconnection to my immediate family. So for me, truth and reconciliation is a path to start re-embracing who we are as Indigenous people, but more than that, who we are as Canadians. It's been said many times that reconciliation isn't just about Indigenous people, it's about all of us. It's about all of us Canadians. We are all treaty people. in this country. So for me, it means kind of reclaiming who I am. It also means that how do I put this? We start moving in a way where we're more inclusive with each other. So when I say that, what I mean is I have colleagues, and I've heard this many times, family, friends, colleagues, where they're not sure how to have this conversation because they're not Indigenous. And so to that, I encourage them that at the end of the day, we are all in this together. And if we come from spirit first, if we come from respect and courage first, and we simply have this conversation in a good way, we teach and walk with each other down the path of reconciliation. It means honoring, I think, maybe even more so. It means honoring residential school survivors. It means giving voice to the experience of residential school. It means not just the survivors, but honoring the families, honoring the little ones who didn't make it home, the thousands of children that have been found in unmarked graves now across this entire country. So history is a difficult topic. It can be dark, it can be hurtful, but it needs to happen if we are going to heal as a nation and move forward as a nation in a good way. Lots of layers there. I got more layers, but I feel like I don't want to take up too much space, so maybe.
But I think that's, and I'll let Shauna answer the question as well, but I think what you say there is very true in terms of being complex. You know, we all have different perspectives. We all have a different connection to our culture and our heritage, and the comfort level to have these conversations just isn't there. It might be we might be further along than we were 2.5 years ago, but it feels like we're really in the beginning stages. So I would imagine it's difficult, no matter what your experience, whether you're from an Indigenous community or not, to articulate what this means, because I don't know that the leadership that created the day of National Truth and Reconciliation actually has a clear definition of what it should mean, right? So maybe Shauna, just to piggyback off what Michelle said, in terms of what that day initially means to you, what's your perspective?
So for me, it means that I need to take action. So I think about when I find out the truth, there's an action that's needed on my part. And we can't take action until we know the full truth. And we're still at a stage where we're finding out the truth. And to pick up on what Michelle has said, we need to really listen to what survivors have said. Children of the survivors have said how that has shaped their lived experience. Really looking at our history and unlearning, because I think about some of the teaching that I received as somebody who wasn't even born on these lands, how I'm taking the step to unlearn, and that's shaping my path. It's helping me take a different direction. So it's taking those little steps of learning, of listening, and to me, that's what this day means to me, is to recognize that I don't know, but not talking about it is not going to help. So talking about it, having those uncomfortable conversations, finding out the truth, being uncomfortable with the truth, and then being moved to meaningful action.
As I mentioned just earlier about the last 2.5 years, how things have kind of changed, the needle has moved. A lot of it has to do not just with Indigenous culture, but just with the world kind of opening its eyes to maybe some of the tragedies that have occurred, whether they're present or centuries ago. You know, for you specifically, Michelle, you know, having identifying as an Indigenous woman, appreciating that culture, and then seeing kind of the world shift with the news of the unmarked graves, and see people, you know, all of a sudden orange shirts are in high demand, and people are, I guess, opening their eyes to maybe some of the truths that have happened. What's that experience been like for you? Just seeing how the media has addressed it, and how the people around you, whether they're friends, neighbors, whomever, how they have kind of started this journey, whether it's where we need to be or not, but have kind of come to some realization that change is necessary?
I think in the beginning, and even beginning to now, I sometimes even still feel a bit of conflict within myself. As I mentioned a moment ago, I see myself as walking two paths in a way. My first thought is that I really hope that people wear orange shirts because they're wearing them because they understand the history and the context and the honor that what the shirt means. So to wear the shirt means that we are honoring the legacy and the history of our country and honoring all of it, the good, the bad, and the really ugly.
So actually, one of the things, maybe you can answer this, Shauna, is I think is a barrier to not just understanding Indigenous issues and history, but also when it comes to all visible minorities and LGBTQ plus communities, is we have people in our society, we all know them, who don't get it, right? They'll say, I didn't do those things. I didn't do anything to harm any community. And why can't people just get over it? That is something you'll hear in a pub down the street or in a backyard barbecue, people not understanding why this is a big deal. And I'm not just talking about this Indigenous issue, but just in issues that affect marginalized communities across the country. Like, why do we as a whole need to pay attention to this and put some work in to understand this a bit better? And maybe start with you, Shauna.
Well, I think it's important because we need to recognize that people didn't all start from the same place. Because of things that have happened in history, people have been marginalized. So we don't all start from the same place. And if I'm starting in a different place from someone else, it impacts the way I engage. It impacts the way I look at myself, the way I look at myself in relation to other people. And so I need to understand that in order to really understand those around me. So people are coming from different places. They've started at different places. And you talked about how sometimes there's reluctance and there's a barrier to people having these conversations. Sometimes these conversations happen and people feel a little shamed into, I feel like I'm being attacked, or so I don't want to deal with it. And the point of these conversations is not to shame people. I believe that people need to understand things like histories and how power and having privilege has put people in unique spaces and given power to some and marginalized some. But it's not about shaming people. It's about understanding that so that we can work towards better outcomes for everyone. So we need to have the conversation, and it's not about shaming. It's about helping people to understand why we are where we are.
So how do we do that, right? You touched on the fact that it can be uncomfortable, right? And I think that is what we do as people sometimes, not everybody, but sometimes when things make us uncomfortable, we avoid them, right? We might not engage in those conversations. And maybe now, when I think about what's happening in Indigenous communities, but also in the Black community since George Floyd's tragedy, and there's been a push like, okay, I need to get past this uncomfortableness that I have inside me, and I need to work through it. I think there is a large segment of the population that do feel like they want to break through and learn more and understand. Might not have the tools, might not know how. If we were to have like a starter kit for uncomfortable conversations about, historically tragic events or misrepresentations in history, like how would you recommend that we have those conversations?
I think we just need to start. And it's messy. And there's not a formula. And it's about starting. But it's also those of us who might be in a place of influence or leadership or having the opportunity to do it, is creating a safe space where people can come as they are and not be afraid to, use the wrong terminology or to not feel that they have to be an expert, and create that safe space for them to learn terminology, learn a little, and to understand those pieces. So it's about creating really spaces for people to talk, where they feel safe and where they feel like they can ask uncomfortable questions and have them answered, or to be given resources, or to be put on the right path. So it's about creating spaces wherever we can to have those conversations.
In terms of organizations, Ontario Shores here, I think has acknowledged that it can do more. And I think actually what you've seen, just looking at places like Indeed and LinkedIn over the last 2.5 years, positions like yours have been created all over the place by organizations who have, I think by nature of creating those positions, have acknowledged that they need to do more, that they're not doing enough. And I think for some of them, they've tried. And I think, I would say on Ontario Shores, we've tried and not necessarily made all the right moves and acknowledge now that more needs to be done. For organizations, and like for both of you, what does it mean to employees when an organization recognizes something, whether it's in their culture or something to do with how they identify, that they're trying to relate, educate, all those things that we talk about? Like, how important do you feel it is for organizations to be speaking to their people, not just their staff, but their stakeholders, whomever?
I think I'd like to start that with going back a bit in history. So I'd like to kind of start by saying, if Germany didn't work at reconciliation after World War II, where would they be today? So I think that's a great example of reconciliation truly in action. So at the end of, as we all, hopefully most Canadians know, at the end of World War II, Germany was arguably probably considered maybe the worst country in history. But the leaders that stepped into that space after the atrocities of World War II made the decision that they needed to reconcile with the world and make amends and take responsibility as a nation. Now, there were many people, and this might tie into something that Shauna said a moment ago, is they did a poll. They surveyed the people in Germany, and there were a significant number of people who still believed in the concepts of racism, anti-Semitism. And there were people that didn't feel that it was their issue. The Third Reich did. It's not our problem. We don't need to work on it. But there was a significant handful that said, no, this is our nation, and we need to be responsible for this. And so if we kind of think about an organization on a grand scale, that's an incredible example about a nation that picked itself up from the ashes of World War II to build themselves up to one of the most, arguably, the most respected countries in the world. And a big part of that was simply acknowledging and walking and working through the truth, the ugly truth of that country's experience. And I think, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Reconciliation has been done by this country, and there are other examples in the world, but that's maybe a really strong template for how even small organizations such as this, I know we're not a country, but we can see by that example about how leadership, when they step up and just allow space for truthful conversation to happen, how that can truly change the world. I think there's always, maybe going to be people that might say, well, this isn't my issue, I didn't do this, this is not my responsibility. And to those people, I might say, well, if it makes you feel uncomfortable, maybe you need to check what that's about. Because having these difficult conversations is really about being uncomfortable. To be honest with you, part of me is feeling uncomfortable having this conversation today. But if we can't, maybe not the word can't, but we need to try to find our courage to have these conversations, because that's how change happens. And as an organization, our leadership needs to step into that space and allow that space to happen so we have these difficult conversations. It's ugly, it's messy, it's painful, it's hurtful. But if all we're feeling is warm fuzziness, then what we're simply doing is feeding into the propaganda that the world is wonderful and these bad things didn't happen. I can see where some people might be uncomfortable saying, again, this isn't my experience, so why should I be responsible for it? To that, I come back to some of my Indigenous teachings, which are, we are spirit beings on a human journey, and as spirit beings, the great creator tells me that we are all brothers and sisters in this vast, beautiful web of life. And it is my responsibility as another spirit being to help take care of my brothers and sisters on this planet. So as a leadership, maybe a way to shift this thinking is to step away from the concept of colonization and patriarchy, these notions where it's the leaders that have to create this. But if you look at Indigenous teachings, we don't sit in hierarchy situations, we sit in circles. And we sit in circles because that reminds us that no one person is greater or less than another. So, when, for example, going back to Germany, they pulled their people. They brought their people into the shift and the change and the reconciliation. And that might be a place where our leadership starts. Creating a platform where we are all one, as opposed to this more top-down concept. And to work at decolonization. Decolonization starts first up here. I have to understand my own, as Shauna put very wonderfully in the beginning, understand what I know, what I've learned, and then challenge myself to say, is that accurate? Is that healthy? Is that helpful? And if it's not, how do I unlearn what I've been conditioned to learn so that I can learn something new that helps my fellow brothers and sisters?
You just mentioned that hierarchy piece and how, that is not going to get us where we need to go. No. And this is just my observation, and I'm just curious how you both feel. It does feel like this time around, the pressure is not coming from the top. While we do have leaders making decisions, whether they're here or any other organization or in government around these issues, it feels like it's more of a groundswell of public opinion and a movement of change that's coming from everyone versus it being from a hierarchy. I'm not sure. I'm just curious what your perspective on that would be. Does it feel different this time around because more people, like more of our neighbors and friends and care?
I think we're at a point in history where we can't ignore it. For a long time, we didn't know the truth, or the truth was hidden from us. And when I think about when we started to discover the unmarked graves, people who their lived experience was part of being survivors of residential schools, they knew that their children weren't coming home. They knew that lives were being lost. But it was just known to them. Now it's known to everyone. So yes, we can't ignore it. It's not just the knowledge of some people saying, hey, we've been marginalized or we've been victimized. So I think it is different in the sense that, and then I think about some of the other things that happened during the pandemic, we can't ignore the racism. It's been recorded. Facts. So yes, it's while it's, we want to see top down, we want to see leaders setting the example and setting the stage and creating the atmosphere, people are crying out for it because we can't ignore it. The facts are there. Technology has brought us to that point as well. Technology has been, I want to say, an ally in this, because when I think about the graves, it was ground penetrating technology. We cannot hide anymore. We've recorded it. It's on our phone. It's on YouTube. So I think, yes, the public is now aware, but what actions we take what are those actions going to be? How do we move people in a positive direction? So there's this angst there that people know that something needs to change, but we need to, again, help people to make positive change, help steer that conversation and those actions.
You reference, what's happened or happening in Germany, probably still happening, I'm guessing, even all these years later. And when I hear the word reconciliation, truth makes sense to me, right? Truth is, is part of the unmarked graves. It's part of understanding the residential school system. I'm sure there's more out there, more truth that needs to be uncovered, but yes, what the definition of truth is makes sense to me, and I can comprehend that in this context that we're talking about Indigenous culture in Canada. The reconciliation part leaves me unclear, right? I haven't seen anything necessarily. I haven't seen anything tangible. The governments have acknowledged days like today and other events, but I struggle with what it actually is and what it could mean. And I'm wondering if you have perspectives on what we need to do in terms of, I think you used the word reconciliation, somebody did a couple times. So what are these actions? Like, how do we get people mobilized in terms of reconciliation and understanding it? I think a big part of it from my perspective, might be just understanding it before I can actually move forward with the actions.
I think that's really important. So, what does reconciliation actually mean to you? And I think that's Orange Shirt Society has a fantastic website. And that could be a great place to start for a lot of people, to just read the history of Orange Shirt Day, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and understanding what it actually means from an Indigenous lens. That might be a great place to start for some folks. But ultimately, Truth and Reconciliation, the website, it'll tell you several things. And one of the things is that reconciliation really is about engaging in conversations like this and honoring the legacy of residential school experiences, to bear witness in a very humble way, to bear witness to the voices of survivors, to the voices of their family, to the ones that didn't come home, and to make a solid commitment to reconcile the tragedies of the past. So through that truth and awareness, we don't make the same mistakes again. We don't go back down that path. It means getting out there. So taking what we say, taking what we read, and actually creating action. So there's if you're an online kind of person, you're a technology kind of person, there's all kinds of websites out there. The Chenny Wenjack Gord Downey Foundation website, website, calls it, it's a legacy of reconciliation, and it's a program for school systems. So reconciliation is things like getting into the public school and the high school systems, the university school systems, and teaching the truth to our children. So changing our textbooks, for starters. If we really think about it, old school textbooks, I don't know, but you, like in high school, we read all about, American history. That's not the history of our country. So changing what the textbooks say, bringing that into our school systems, teaching our children when they're young the true history of our country. Again, Germany does the same thing. That's mandatory in their school systems. Well, why can't that be part of our school systems, that we mandatorily teach this knowledge to our children? And that is a great place to start from the groundswell. You mentioned the groundswell. If the groundswell absolutely moving, we have to start with our next generation, right? So in Indigenous teaching is, how do we teach the coming generations? Because they are the generations that will rise up and hold up the world after us, take care of the world after us. So it's fundamental that we teach them. Things like if you're not into maybe going to community events, start reading. There are some phenomenal books and literature and articles written by Indigenous people that are very truthful and honest and harsh and hard to read. What else could we do? Attend websites, attend as you mentioned earlier, Darryl, Orange Shirt Week. So there's all kinds of community events across the whole province, and I would argue across the whole nation for sure. In Durham Region, go online, check out what events are happening, get to them. I'm going to powwow this weekend up at Curve Lake. That's part of what I'm doing. I read, talk to my family, talk to my friends. We're here. We're doing this podcast. This is reconciliation in action.
Do you find people come to you, like people that may not be in your community that come to you with questions? What are some of the things that you hear from those people?
I think I want to come back to a point I said, I think early in the beginning, which was my non-Indigenous friends and colleagues, for example, are very unsure about where to step. I don't know if I'm asking this question right. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. And I think that there's a genuine fear in some people that they truly want to come from a good, honest, genuine place, but there's a fear or a concern that they're going to misstep and then they're going to be called out for it. So I think reconciliation also was about creating a healthy space that we, even though we might fear saying the wrong thing, taking that misstep is all about education. And if I don't say something in a healthy way, but someone can say, hey, Michelle, that's really not a healthy way to say that, and educate me as to how to say it in a healthy way or in a good way or in a respectful way, then I'm learning in that live moment.
Kind of like what happened earlier when we were deciding who would do the land acknowledgement, and I was uncomfortable doing it, and luckily Shauna stepped up. But there's probably an example of where I could have faced that challenge, but the fear of misstepping, kind of won over in that moment. So just something that dawned on me while you're talking. But it's an example of the things we do all the time, right? We maybe good intentioned because we don't want to hurt people's feelings, but and we're afraid of making ourselves an object of attention for something that we perceive as negative, whereas somebody might look at that and say, might appreciate the effort more so than the result, right? Speaking of Shauna, here at Ontario Shores, I know we're preparing for Orange Shirt Week, and as well as acknowledging September 30th. If you can talk a little bit about what we're going to do and what maybe the reconciliation, right, I already gave it away, but the reconciliation piece that you have planned for our hospital.
So I think during Orange Shirt Day is on the same day as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So we're calling it on Orange Shirt Week, and we have we're encouraging the whole Ontario Shores community to engage in taking small steps towards reconciliation. So actually writing down the little steps that they're going to take and showcasing them, putting our name to it, putting our personal stamp on it, and we're going to display those and leave them up for people to really reflect on them. So really starting the journey by encouraging people to take steps towards reconciliation and being public about it and being purposeful about it and not being afraid. So that's one thing. And then also making resources available, like you've talked about, webinars, videos, reading lists to encourage our community to learn more about Indigenous history and Indigenous teachings and Indigenous lived experiences. And one of the resources, you were talking about resources, and how do we do this work? The Truth and Reconciliation Truth and Reconciliation Commission gives us a roadmap. There was calls on governments and institutions and businesses as to what they can do to reconcile with Indigenous communities. So that's a great place to start. So making all of those resources available to the Ontario Shores community.
And if I can add to that, actually, you bring up the calls to action, which is fantastic. What a great resource. One of the challenges that I have had people say to me is, if you get the 94 calls and you read them, they tend to present as government system like school community, education community, hospital community oriented. And some people, I've had people come to me going, well, how does this apply to me? And then my challenge to them might be, or my encouragement might be, well, pick an action or a call that might kind of fit your area. So let's say you're an educator. How might you break down the education component so that it actually fits you? So for example, if you don't know much about history, do your research and maybe find a great book. 21 Things You Might Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph is a phenomenal book that kind of starts introducing people to residential schools, the Indian Act itself, and at the back what those calls mean and how we can start breaking down calls to action, breaking down the Indian Act, and having just a conversation around that. We're in healthcare, mental health and physical healthcare. Well, how do we break that down? Well, how do we, again, start decolonizing? We start doing that in our own mind. So as opposed to seeing, say, the calls to action and saying, well, this is this doesn't really apply to me. Well, it applies to every single one of us. How do you break that down and make baby steps and apply it to yourself? I think that's important as well.
I think a lot of what we're talking about is building trust and taking those steps for everybody's part is to build trust, and hopefully even something that may be 1 week of the year or 1 day of the year, it's a step towards all of us building trust and being educated. I want to thank you both for the conversation. I think we've used the word uncomfortable a series of times in the last little while, and it's not unlike when we talk about human rights issues and other things at Ontario Shores, inclusion, diversity. We've had podcasts and events on all of those events, and it does go back to that uncomfortable piece because we're not used to having these conversations, right? We're used to staying in our lanes, and a lot of times as children, we were told, like, mind your business, stay in your lane, don't go outside there, don't be too, it's okay to be curious, but not too curious. And I think that we're changing that and recognizing days like today and what you have planned, Shauna, for the week really helps move us in that direction. So thank you both for being here and being uncomfortable with us, all three of us together. And
thanks for, on behalf of us, no, I don't want to sound exclusive, but I really appreciate the honor of being here and being gifted by your voice and being gifted by Shauna's voice, and just being a part of, hopefully, reconciliation in movement, by lending our voice to change and just having the courage to sit in what feels uncomfortable. I know my heart's been racing a few times answering some of these questions, feeling very uncomfortable, feeling a bit of the heat and the pressure, but we moved through it anyways. And that's what change is feeling what we feel, but just recognize it's an uncomfortable feeling. It's the key is having the courage to just speak the truth, and feeling safe to do so, and creating that environment where we're all moving through it in a good way, moving forward in a good way, in a respectful way, a courageous way.
Great. Awesome.